Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine trying to build a mosque in Munich back in the middle of the 20th century. You'd think that'd be a fairly local, maybe complex, but ultimately religious community project,
You
right?
would think so.
Well, buckle up, because the story is anything but simple. It's a wild ride through a tangled web involving unexpected connections, global superpowers vying for influence, and religion being used as a very deliberate tool in the biggest geopolitical game of the era.
Exactly. What we're diving into today is the history of the Islamic Center of Munich. We're going to trace its truly unexpected origins and look at how this specific mosque project became a critical foothold and really a key base for the Muslim Brotherhood right here in Europe.
And this whole deep dive is based on a stack of sources you've shared with us, primarily a really detailed historical account that pulls back the curtain on this fascinating period.
Mhm. Our mission today is to understand how the chaos after World War II, the intense Cold War competition between the West and the Soviet Union, and this often overlooked world of Muslim emigres from the Soviet Union all intersected in Germany. This intersection, driven by some surprising motivations and involving some truly complex, sometimes even, well, unsavory characters, actually laid foundational groundwork for significant Islamic movements we see in the West today.
Right.
We'll look at the players, their often conflicting goals, and the crucial, often unintended consequences of their actions.
So where does this story really begin? We're going back to the chaos of World War II, specifically the Eastern Front.
That's right.
Our story kicks off with a very human element.
Yeah.
A young Tatar soldier named Garap Sultan. He's conscripted into the Soviet Red Army, he's poorly equipped, and he's thrown right into the brutal German invasion of 1941.
Yeah, Sultan's unit was a pretty desperate setup.
Yeah.
Mostly non-Russians, poorly trained. They were basically sent into a meat grinder's position and cut to pieces by German machine gun fire.
Ah.
Sultan was the only survivor in his group. He hid for 2 days, just trying to make it back to his own lines.
And this wasn't his first time seeing the harsh side of regimes. Earlier, in a Soviet POW camp, he'd been forced to dig anti-tank trenches alongside prisoners from the Gulag.
Mm-hmm.
And there, he heard something that stuck with him. An old Tatar prisoner told him that life in German camps during World War I had actually been better than serving in the Tsar's army, and some Tatar prisoners had even fought for the Germans back then.
Right. And Sultan listened carefully to that idea. The idea that maybe siding with the Germans wasn't the worst option.
A seed planted.
Meanwhile, from the Nazi perspective, there was a very specific interest in the Soviet Union's non-Russian minorities. They saw regions like the Caucasus and Turkestan, with their Muslim populations, as potentially fertile ground for finding allies or, well, recruiting soldiers to fight the Soviets. They viewed certain groups as historically significant, distinct from the Russians.
And this led to the formation of units like the East Turkestani Armed Formation, which ultimately came under SS command.
Yeah, these units weren't just symbolic. They fought partisans in places like Ukraine and Italy, and yes, they even helped put down the Warsaw City Uprising. Grim stuff.
Very grim. And a central figure in this Nazi effort to exploit Soviet minorities was Gerhard von Mende.
Ah, von Mende, yes.
He was a Baltic German from Riga and headed the Tatar Liaison Office within the Ostministerium, that's the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories.
Basically the Nazi regime's department for administering and exploiting conquered lands in the East.
Exactly. And von Mende was actually a pre-war scholar of Soviet minorities. He'd written a book, The Peoples of the Soviet Union. But by the time of the war, his work had become absolutely steeped in anti-Semitism, adopting outright Nazi slogans.
Yeah, completely. He was even present at the notorious Wannsee Conference through his boss, Alfred Leibrandt.
So deeply embedded. And von Mende relied heavily on émigré collaborators, people who already had a beef with the Soviet system.
Uh-huh. A prime example is Vili Qayyum, who became von Mende's personal protege. Qayyum perfectly echoed Nazi propaganda slogans and even went so far as to denounce opponents within the émigré community to the Gestapo.
Wow. So, using existing tensions, it's worth understanding that while von Mende twisted it horribly, this built on a longer, somewhat questionable German tradition of Orientalist scholarship. That's the academic study of Eastern cultures.
Which often in this era came with a certain European, sometimes biased perspective. Yes, that's the backdrop.
Okay, so fast forward past the war. Germany is defeated, divided.
Right.
But West Germany quickly became a refuge for many of these same Soviet minorities who had collaborated with the Nazis. They feared, absolutely rightly, forced repatriation back to the Soviet Union.
Which would likely mean execution or the Gulag. They were terrified.
Understandably. And this post-war landscape isn't just about rebuilding. It becomes a new kind of battlefield, a shadow war.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
British intelligence, MI6, was quick to get involved, backing anti-Soviet groups. We see them supporting outfits like the Scottish League for European Freedom and the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations,
And guess who's involved?
which, surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, included ex-Osministerium collaborators, like our friend Garib Sultan.
There he is again.
Then came the much larger American effort. The CIA got heavily involved, funding the American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism, known as AMCOMLIB.
Comlib. Okay.
Its main goal initially was psychological warfare against the Soviets, primarily using these same émigrés through Radio Liberty, broadcasting behind the Iron Curtain.
And guess who shows up on the payroll?
Well, many of those former Ostministerium figures von Mende had used. Garib Sultan is there, along with Ahmad Berdimurat, Veli Zunan, Hussein Ikran, Edijit Kirmal, and Abdul Fattah.
Fattah. He was the one found murdered, wasn't he?
Yeah, tragically, just a year after Radio Liberty started broadcasting, unsolved. And many of these people had been directly involved in Nazi propaganda efforts during the war.
It's quite a cast of characters.
What's truly striking here, looking at the sources, is the parallel. AMCOMLIB's approach of recruiting and using this specific émigré political elite for anti-Soviet purposes looks remarkably similar to von Mende's methods in the Ostministerium.
That's fascinating. Was it conscious imitation or just pragmatism?
Probably a mix. There was also significant tension within AMCOMLIB itself, a clash between the Radio Liberty staff, who saw themselves as journalists broadcasting news, and intelligence types like Robert Dreher.
The CIA liaison.
Right, Dreher. He was far more focused on using the platform for ideology and, well, covert operations.
Robert Dreher is a key figure on the American side then. He was essentially seconded from the CIA to MCOMLIB, keeping his rank and pay. His job was high-ranking, vetting broadcast material, making sure the right anti-Soviet message was getting out. He'd previously served in naval intelligence and had extensive contacts with Soviets post-war.
And Frank Wisner, who headed the Office of Policy Coordination within the CIA, was one of the driving forces behind recruiting many of these anti-communist émigrés in the first place. It was about utility, plain and simple. Who could be useful against the Soviets?
Right. The ends justifying the memes, perhaps.
Perhaps. Okay, so by the mid-1950s, the Cold War in Europe had reached a bit of a stalemate. Both sides were dug in.
Okay.
As a result, the superpowers' focus began shifting. They started looking more towards the developing world, particularly the newly independent countries forming the non-aligned movement, highlighted by significant conferences like Bandung in 1955 and 1958.
And this geopolitical shift meant the U.S. needed new strategies beyond just European containment.
Exactly.
A key idea emerged to counter growing Soviet influence in Muslim-majority countries by actively engaging with Muslim figures and organizations.
Religion wasn't just a background factor anymore. It became a high priority, noted in internal memos like the religious factor, and championed at the highest levels, even by President Eisenhower himself.
So weaponizing religion in a sense? Or at least leveraging it?
Leveraging it, certainly. And we see specific U.S. operations directly targeting this new focus. In 1954, the CIA sponsored two Muslims, Rusi Nassar and Hamid Rashid, both, incidentally, former collaborators with the Nazis, now recruited by U.S. intelligence,
Of course.
to disrupt Soviet pilgrims at the Hajj in Mecca, literally throwing tomatoes and distributing anti-Soviet propaganda flyers.
Wow. That's quite direct.
They pulled similar stunts at the Bandung Conference in 1955.
Okay, so this is where Sayyid Ramadan enters the picture, and he's a pivotal character.
Absolutely pivotal.
Yeah.
Ramadan had strong ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was growing in influence, and to the controversial Grand Mufti of Jerusalem.
Right.
He was invited to participate in the 1953 Princeton Islamic Colloquium, a significant event sponsored by the U.S. Information Agency,
USIA.
with financial help from Ramco. At this colloquium and afterward, Ramadan actively sought to connect with U.S. officials.
So he saw an opportunity there, too.
Definitely. And what's really significant is how U.S. intelligence agencies, particularly AMCOMLIB and the CIA, started to favor figures like Ramadan over some of the others they were backing.
Why him specifically?
His international connections, his ties to the Muslim Brotherhood network, and his strong anti-communist stance made him seem more appealing, perhaps more effective, than figures supported primarily by West German intelligence, like Nuruddin Amagani.
So, a strategic calculation by the U.S.
It seems so. While the sources don't offer a single smoking gun document saying back Ramadan, There are many indications, patterns of financial and political support that point to Amcumlib and the CIA using their leverage to support Ramadan. It looked like a strategic choice.
Meanwhile, back in Germany, Gerhard von Mende is still active, now working for the West German government.
Still pulling strings. He's desperately trying to maintain his network of ex-Os Ministerium colleagues. He's even using what became known as Purcell certificates.
Like the washing powder.
Exactly. Letters or documents intended to help rehabilitate their image, essentially trying to wash away their Nazi pasts. He mentored figures like Sultan and Beymir Zahate, getting them funding through various West German agencies.
So he's trying to keep his old network relevant in the new Cold War context.
Precisely. Von Mende even tried to counter this growing U.S. influence by sending his own agents, Namangani and Haidt, on a Hajj trip in 1959, sort of a German-backed mission.
How did that go?
Well, what they found when they got there really bothered him. Said Ramadan was already on the ground, successfully creating the widespread perception that the planned Munich Mosque project, a project von Mende had also been interested in, was actually an American initiative.
Ouch. Outmaneuvered.
Yeah, it became painfully clear to the West Germans that they simply couldn't compete with the resources and the sheer scale of the superpowers playing this game. They were small fry in comparison.
And that brings us right to the heart of it. The battle for the Munich Mosque itself. The project to build a central mosque in the city wasn't just a building project. It became a focal point, essentially a proxy battleground for these different intelligence-backed factions.
You had various groups trying to promote a mosque project. There were German-backed groups, including figures like Ibrahim Gakaoglu, Nuruddin Namangani, and Ali Kantemir pushing their own visions.
Right.
And then you had the U.S.-backed figures like Said Ramadan and this truly incredibly intriguing character, Ahmad Kamal.
Ahmad Kamal, also known as Samarin Hathaway. Now he sounds like something out of a novel.
He really does. One of the most fascinating and unusual backgrounds in this whole story. He had links to Hollywood. He worked as an adventure writer. He traveled extensively in Turkestan.
Potential intelligence links.
German intelligence reports at the time even claimed he had potential links to U.S. intelligence, suggesting he might have reported directly to figures like Vice President Nixon or the NSC's Operations Coordinating Board. That's what the German reports claimed. Though, interestingly, U.S. archives on this specific link remain silent. So, unconfirmed from the U.S. side.
Okay.
Kamal created an organization he called Jamiat al-Islam. He even wrote a book, giving it a fabricated history, claiming it was founded in Turkestan in the 1860s, specifically to fight the Russians.
Fabricated history. That's bold.
Yeah. The organization engaged in some genuinely strange activities, and its newsletters sometimes sowed confusion among local officials in Munich. This confusion, oddly enough, may have inadvertently run interference for Ramadan's efforts, making the landscape less clear for rivals.
Strange bedfellows.
Kamal also had a relationship with a figure named Tuhami Louahala and got into conflict with the Jordanian government, possibly due to his support for Palestinian nationalists and ties to the Grand Mufti. So, very complex character.
And just to make things even more complicated, it wasn't just the Western powers vying for influence over this mosque project.
Note, the Soviets were also trying to get in on the act, attempting to fund their own mosque project in Munich, specifically to undermine the Americans and their proxies. Everyone wanted a piece of this.
So, a complete free-for-all.
Pretty much. And in the midst of all this maneuvering and rival intelligence operations, said Ramadan, despite initially not having deep ties to the existing local Munich Muslim community of émigrés.
Right, he wasn't really one of them initially.
No. But he strategically navigated these competing forces. With likely support from Amcumlib, the sources strongly suggest this backing was key. He gradually consolidated his influence.
How did he manage that?
He managed to marginalize his rivals and eventually became the chairman of the Mosque Building Commission. The sheer confusion caused by competing groups like Kamal's Jamiat may have actually helped him by making his group, with its clearer backing and more organized approach, seem like the more stable and legitimate option to local German authorities.
So the Americans backed the winner, it seems.
It looks that way. So after all this international intrigue, intelligence competition, and political maneuvering, the Islamic Center of Munich finally opened its doors in 1973.
1973, okay.
And by this point, the demographics of Muslims in Europe were undergoing a massive transformation. We're talking about post-war guest workers, like the large number of Turks who came to Germany.
Right, the gastarbeiter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And migration from former colonies in countries like France and Britain. This led to significant established Muslim populations across the continent.
So Europe was changing.
Massively. From a traditional Islamic perspective, this change meant Europe was, in a sense, rejoining the Dar al-Islam, the
Mm.
House of Islam, meaning lands where Muslims can openly practice their faith, and where Islamic law is in effect or is a strong aspiration.
And right at this pivotal moment, the Muslim Brotherhood was perfectly positioned.
Perfectly. They had already established a crucial base in the West through figures like said Ramadan and the organizations linked to the Munich Mosque project. The mosque wasn't just a place of worship. It became a critical beachhead for their strategic expansion and influence across Europe.
So the Cold War machinations inadvertently gave them this key foothold.
That's the argument, yes. The leadership of the mosque, once established, was actually quite notable for its exclusionary nature. For example, in 1974, Turkish guest workers, a huge part of the potential community, were explicitly denied membership.
Wait, denied why?
Despite the bylaws stating any Muslim could join, the reason given was that accepting them would hurt cohesion.
Cohesion, that sounds odd, especially given the mosque's Ottoman style and the huge Turkish population.
It is pretty striking. But while ordinary Turkish guest workers were kept out, prominent Islamist activists from abroad were welcomed with open arms.
Like who?
People like Khurshid Ahmad from Pakistan and Isam al-Attar, who was the head of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, were accepted as members. Membership in the Munich Mosque became a mark of honor for these international figures, effectively turning it into a vehicle for their broader Islamist struggle and network building in the West.
So less a community mosque, more an elite hub for a specific movement.
That's how it appears to have functioned early on. This base in Munich directly contributed to the growth of key Muslim Brotherhood-linked organizations across Europe. These groups were often connected through individuals who'd been associated with the Munich Mosque or Ramadan himself. Examples include the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, FIOE,
FIOE, okay.
and its associated bodies like the Institute for Study of Human Sciences, the European Council for Fatwa and Research, which issues religious rulings for Muslims in Europe, and the European Trust.
And these organizations received funding.
From various sources, including groups like the Maktoum Charity Foundation.
Okay. And the ideology promoted by these networks, what was the core message?
It emphasizes Islam as a total package, covering all aspects of life, politics, society, personal conduct, defining proper Muslim behavior, often based on more fundamentalist interpretations.
All right.
Figures like Yusuf Qaradawi, a widely known and sometimes controversial scholar, became prominent in these circles. Ibrahim el-Zayat, a key figure in the European Brotherhood network, even lost a court case in Germany that essentially affirmed his role as a functionary of the Muslim Brotherhood.
So legally recognized as such?
Yes, and it's also important to note, as the source points out, that some material promoted by figures linked to these networks has included virulently anti-Semitic content, such as the citing of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
The notorious fabrication.
Exactly, a text used to promote anti-Jewish conspiracy theories.
Right.
So that element was present in some circles connected to these networks.
Now, the relationship between these groups and terrorism is complex, and the source is careful about how it presents this.
Extremely complex, yes. While some figures convicted of terror offenses, like Mahmoud Abu Halima and Mahmoud Salim involved in early World Trade Center plots, did have connections to the Munich Mosque leadership, specifically a figure named Khalifa.
Okay, so there were connections.
Personal connections, yes. But the source notes there isn't definitive proof that core organizations like Nada's Banco Al-Taqwa directly finance terrorism through mainstream banking channels.
So a nuance there.
A definite nuance.
Mm-hmm.
Personal links existed, but a direct organizational money trail via official means isn't conclusively proven by the source, although it mentions early zakat charity donations might have gone to questionable groups before things were formalized.
Right. This complexity feeds directly into the broader debate about engaging with the Muslim Brotherhood, doesn't it?
Absolutely. U.S. perspectives on this have varied wildly over the years. Some State Department and CIA reports at different times actually viewed them as a potential alternative to more violent jihadist groups.
Echoes of that 1950s pragmatism again.
Kind of, yeah. Reflecting a mindset not entirely dissimilar to that approach back then. However, on the flip side, figures like Tariq Ramadan, said Ramadan's son and a prominent intellectual, have been denied entry to the U.S. by the Department of Homeland Security, citing affiliations.
So a real split in approach.
Definitely. And it's a key point the source makes that resonates today. What looks like a moderate position in the context of political movements in the Middle East can often be perceived very differently, sometimes seen as radical, within the European context. Perspectives differ greatly.
That's a crucial distinction.
To wrap up this deep dive, it's worth noting that Gerhard von Mende's operations for West Germany eventually faded as the country's foreign policy shifted towards detente with the East.
His network became less relevant.
Less useful, less funded. But in a strange historical irony, years later, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the U.S. government actually became interested in studying von Mende's old methods again.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Why?
They commissioned a Rand Corporation report to see if his tactics for stirring up Soviet Muslims against Moscow could be useful for arming the Afghan mujahideen. History does have a way of coming back around, sometimes in very odd ways.
Wow. Full circle.
But the core legacy we've uncovered today is how the initial, often short-sighted interest of Western intelligence agencies, British and American, in using Muslim émigrés, primarily for their Cold War purposes, inadvertently created a critical opening.
Right.
And provided a physical institutional base, the Munich Mosque, that the Muslim Brotherhood was able to exploit. This allowed them to establish a significant foothold and expand their influence across Europe in ways that continue to shape dynamics today.
So we've journeyed from the brutal battlefields of World War II and Nazi ideologues manipulating minority groups through the post-war chaos where British and American intelligence competed using the same pool of displaced people, right up to CIA operatives and Muslim intellectuals vying for control and influence, all converging on what seemed like the simple goal of building a mosque in one German city.
Quite a journey.
And the key takeaway for you listening is how the historical reality behind how certain religious and political movements took root and grew in Europe is far more complex, interconnected, and driven by surprising, sometimes cynical geopolitical factors than most conventional narratives suggest.
Absolutely. These movements weren't isolated or purely local developments. They were shaped by global power struggles playing out in unexpected places.
It makes you really consider how actions taken for what seem like necessary short-term geopolitical gains can have profound, often completely unintended, long-term consequences that ripple out and shape societies in ways nobody predicted at the time.
Exactly. Today's headlines, especially concerning religious and political dynamics in Europe, often have deep and complicated roots in these forgotten histories. Things are rarely as simple as they seem on the surface.